If you have watched a World War II movie or documentary, it's likely that you have noted an odd-looking but Wehrmacht iconic half-track lugging around German soldiers. In a time when most combatants still walked through terrain on the last stretch to the battlefield, this armored personnel carrier turned infantry tactics on its head and played an essential role in perfecting the concept of Bewegungskrieg, commonly referred to as Blitzkrieg. While the world watched on in horror as the claws of the tigers and panthers tore Europe asunder, it was only when coupled with this humbler partner that they were able to truly revolutionize warfare. Today, we're looking at the birth of German mechanized infantry. We're looking at the Sd.Kfz 251. I'm Spartacus Olsen, and this is a German Rearmament special separated from my usual coverage of Death of Democracy, looking at the ways that the Nazi state worked behind the scenes throughout the 1930s to deceive other nations, subvert the terms of the Versailles Treaty, and end up with the war machine they did in 1939 and beyond. Today we're looking at the companion of the Panzers and harbinger of the Panzer Grenadiers, the Sd.Kfz 251. The Mittlere Schützenpanzerwagen, to call it by its other name, was the definitive German armored personnel carrier of World War II, a vehicle that bridged the gap between the speed of the Panzer and the vulnerability of the infantryman. Integrating this system into the Wehrmacht was essential for their developing concentrated armor assault doctrine. Panzers could not act completely independently of infantry. Rough or broken ground still occasionally required infantry to clear out anti-tank guns that could be lethal to tanks but vulnerable to flanking infantry. So infantry must be brought up along with the Panzers at the same pace, with some armor of their own to protect from some small arms fire. To circumvent the Treaty of Versailles, which strictly limited armored vehicle development, the Sd.Kfz 251 was clandestinely evolved from the unarmored Sd.Kfz 11, which itself was more of an artillery towing and utility vehicle. The 251 was then ostensibly designed to fulfill the same role, which allowed German designers to refine semi-track technology under a non-combatant guise, exploiting a loophole in the Versailles stipulations. By the time open rearmament was declared, the 251 was already well on the road to becoming a key part of the German Panzer divisions, providing the mobility and protection necessary for infantry to survive on a modern, high-intensity battlefield. Over 15,000 units will eventually be produced. Technically, the Sd.Kfz 251 is a semi-tracked armored personnel carrier with an empty weight of about 8 metric tons. It is powered by a Maybach HL42 six-cylinder water-cooled gasoline engine developing 100 horsepower at 2,800 RPM and features a Hanomag transmission with 4 forward and 1 reverse gear, coupled with a 2-speed transfer case that effectively provides 8 forward speeds for off-road use. Its steering system was designed to utilize both the wheels and the tracks in harmony to maximize maneuverability. The front wheels move similarly to road cars for slight turns, while turns sharper than 15 degrees engage a steering differential that applies brakes to one track, a complexity that granted superior cross-country performance compared to simpler Allied designs. It sports some front-nose armored plating, 14.5mm thick, while the side and rear plates are 8mm, sloped at angles to maximize ballistic protection against 7.92mm armor-piercing rounds, protecting its contents or occupants. The expected contents, in this case, would be a single Wehrmacht-Gruppe, usually 10 but sometimes up to 12 soldiers, with their equipment and munitions. In theory, these troops could then either fire directly from the vehicle while idle, or in motion, or dismount to engage their foes. The 251 could join the fight alongside them too, typically sporting 2 7.92mm MG-34 or MG-42 machine guns. 1 forward mounting with protective shield and 1 rear mounted on a swivel for anti-aircraft and rear ground fire. The 251 originated from a 1935 requirement for a specialized vehicle capable of accompanying panzers into battle. Since about 1925, the Statistische Gesellschaft, known colloquially as STEGA, had been working to envision future production chains between civilian and military sources in the Weimar Republic, and since 1933, Nazi Germany, in case of possible rearmament. All very hush-hush. The Nazis, of course, inherited this work, which placed them in a prime position to begin subordinating civilian industry towards secret rearmament. In late 1934, an experimental armored division is assembled for testing and doctrinal scrutiny. It is here that the importance of infantry integration in the Panzer arm really begins to be noted. That same year, at the suggestion of the Wehrmacht, a Vereinigte Stahlwerke United Steelworks subsidiary, Bochum Verein, acquired the floundering company Hanomag specifically to repurpose it into an artillery and armored vehicle producer. By now, German armor tacticians began to realize that tanks operating alone were vulnerable to anti-tank guns and isolated infantry, and in late 1935, Panzer theorist Heinz Guderian submitted a list of proposals for a specially designed vehicle explicitly for the transport and deployment of infantry along Panzers. The 251 was therefore intended for tactical operational deployment within Schützen regiments, or later Panzer Grenadiers. It would serve as a mobile shield that allowed infantry to reach the point of assault without dismounting prematurely. This enabled a combined arms approach where tanks and infantry operated as a unified force, advancing at speed, retreating flexibly, and fighting alongside one another as a single unit. Now, work on finding a manufacturer and developing a prototype begins quite soon after that, but it isn't until 1937 that the design of the 251 really begins to take shape. The vehicle ultimately selected for this new piece of equipment turns out to be the Hanomag 3-ton artillery tractor, the Sd.Kfz 11. The design of the 251, however, will be a collaborative effort. Hanomag in Hannover is entrusted with the mechanical chassis, while Bussing NAG in Berlin-Oberschöneweide will design the armored superstructure. The first prototypes are tested in 1938. Through this phase, the 251 is still referred to officially as a mittlere gepanzerte Mannschaftstransportwagen, a troop transport, rather than a combat vehicle. Mass production commences in June 1939, mere months before continental Europe goes up in flames. Due to shortages of hardened armor plating around this time, plenty of the early 251s are shipped with an unhardened carbon steel superstructure, which provides almost no real protection from armor-piercing rounds, but still technically fulfills doctrinal requirements and brings the Panzer division online, so to speak. Production of the Sd.Kfz 251, like much other German wartime production, was a decentralized industrial effort involving firms such as Hanomag, Adlerwerke, MNH, WUMAG, and Schichau. Between June 1939 and April 1945, approximately 15,252 units will be produced across all variants. Models, or Ausführungen A through D, account for the overwhelming majority of the production, with Dora D accounting for 10,602, or roughly 70% of all units shipped. There are a couple of reasons for this. Firstly, the superstructure of Ausführungen A through C was essentially quite over-engineered, sporting sloped armor plating which required specialist production facilities and staff to create. Early production was therefore remarkably inefficient and almost always in short supply, even among the best-equipped Panzer divisions. For most of the war, most divisions could only afford to outfit a single company of each armored infantry regiment with these vehicles, and deployed them sparingly, since losing their stock of 251s could hamper the division's combat effectiveness at a similar magnitude to losing tanks themselves. The Ausführung D, then, was designed with simplification and mass production in mind, reducing the angle of the sloped armor plating by about 50%, simplifying a lot of the armor forging and assembly, making them far easier to mass produce. That, coupled with the consolidation and restructuring of Armaments Minister Albert Speer, saw the production statistic leap ahead towards the late war, accelerating to 754 units in September 1944 and 7,785 units in the year as a whole, more than double the production numbers of 1943. As With the entire German armaments industry at this point, its production relied heavily on Albert Speer's and the SS murderous slave operations. Borgward, Hanomag, and Auto Union all sourced slave labor in the subcamps of Flossenburg and Neuengamme, where many perished under the harsh working and living conditions. Before all of that, it formally entered service trials in 1939 and saw limited combat in the Polish campaign, though it performed well in what action it did see. By the invasion of France in May 1940, numbers had grown somewhat, and the 251 was now a common sight in the Schützen companies used to spearhead armor thrusts through the Ardennes and beyond. It would eventually be deployed to every major front Germany fought in, from the deserts of North Africa to the frozen steppes of Russia and the narrow lanes of the bocage of Normandy. Its tactical intention remained constant: keep the infantry close to the tanks during the advance to allow for immediate, mutually supporting fire and flexibility in engaging dug-in targets. Beyond operating as an armored troop carrier, the 251 was developed and deployed into myriad other roles. This list I'm about to give you is not extensive, but here's some of the most interesting and oddest one. The 251/1 with Wurfrahmen 40, Stuka on foot, known by some troops as the Bellowing Cow, carrying 6 wooden or metal frames from which to deploy 28 and 32 centimeter rocket barrages, the same distinctively sounding rockets fired from the Nebelwerfer 41. The 251/10, which carried a 3.7 centimeter Pak 36 on its forward superstructure, designed to provide light anti-tank fire support to infantry sections without the need to call on Panzers themselves. Then we have his big brother, the 251/22. Same idea, but this time with a 7.5 centimeter Pak 40, which totally overloaded the vehicle, meant to compensate for the lack of available tank chassis that could be turned into proper tank destroyers. The 251/17 anti-aircraft variant, which mounted a 2 centimeter Flak 38 AA cannon. The earlier models of this particular variant were built with a fold-down superstructure, allowing the AA guns to traverse a full 360-degree range, while later models used a pedestal turret that made this unnecessary. Then we have the Funkpanzerwagen, the 251/3, a dedicated radio vehicle, the 251/11, which laid and maintained telephone wires in the field, and the 251/19, which could operate as a mobile telephone switchboard. There were also bridging vehicles, flamethrower variants, ambulance vehicles, and so on. You get the picture. What began as an adventure into a world of modern armored infantry evolved to become an incredible versatile tool in the Wehrmacht arsenal, which could be tweaked to serve almost any purpose and plug any gap it was required to. The tactical impact of the vehicle was massive. It transformed infantry from a slow-moving follow-up force into a high-speed strike element. German commanders no longer had to think about slow-moving infantry support tanks as many Allied nations were experimenting with. They had approached the problem in reverse and created tank support infantry instead. Instead, groups of Schützen or Panzer Grenadiers could deploy quickly, clear out anti-tank positions ahead of the Panzer's advance, and prevent stalls and slowdowns, where previously tanks may have had to wait for infantry to move up in support, bleeding away momentum during a breakthrough. While it couldn't survive tank-caliber hits, its armor provided sufficient protection against shell splinters and most rifles or machine guns, which German soldiers noted as its most vital asset. Indeed, Heinz Guderian himself called the 251 the greatest saver of blood that the Wehrmacht possessed in its arsenal. Compared to the US M3 Halftrack, the 251 had superior cross-country mobility and better infantry protection, though it lacked the M3's higher road speed and ease of serviceability. There were, of course, vulnerabilities too. In street fighting, the 251 particularly suffered. The open-top design meant that its passengers were always at risk of snipers, and more terrifyingly, the possibility of a grenade being thrown from an upper window directly into the passenger section. The vehicle could also be quite uncomfortable, both to drive and to fight out of. The awkward mix of road wheels and tracks could be confusing for newcomers to drive, and passengers often found the vehicle cramped and uncomfortable. A small price to pay for safety perhaps, but living and fighting out of a vehicle like the 251 could certainly take its toll on troops, and plenty of them were not shy about saying so. Attrition was also high in the late war. Defensive fighting meant that the 251s often had to act as ad hoc suppression brigades, using their vehicle-mounted weaponry to lay down suppressing and supporting fire when infantry groups lacked enough machine guns and personnel to do it themselves. This resulted in heavy losses from Allied air superiority and superior tank numbers, both for the standard types employed in this way and especially for the anti-tank variants I mentioned earlier. Ultimately, while lethal in its specialized role, the 251 also suffered from the chronic German fuel and material shortages that paralyzed the Luftwaffe and Panzer divisions by 1944. Like the Panzers, the 251 could not escape the fundamental realities of the impossible war economy the Nazis pursued, which become ever acuter, so that by late 1944 and 1945, both their numbers and their effectiveness had dwindled. So, the Sd.Kfz 251 served the German war effort effectively in the beginning as the system that transformed the Panzer Division into a fully functional, truly integrated combined arms force. Beyond simply increasing the effectiveness of the Panzer arm, it proved to be an incredibly versatile and useful vehicle in its own right, being integrated into artillery, anti-tank, and utility roles, all separate from its original intended function. But ultimately, it was part of the delusions of superiority that plagued German warfare from the get-go. While unquestionably a technological and doctrinal success, it was yet another arms system that the Nazis could not really afford. Thus, the Wehrmacht never truly found itself with the numbers it desired and was often forced to make do with what was available rather than maintain a fully equipped mechanized force. Early production inefficiency, lack of available means and material, and fuel shortages in the late war prevented the 251 from living up to its full potential as a game changer. Post-war, its influence was profound, first for the victors and to this day for armies across the world. It directly contributed to the evolution of the modern infantry fighting vehicle and the armored personnel carrier, which operate as the mainstay of infantry divisions in first-rate militaries today. Production even continued in Czechoslovakia as the OTU-810, serving well into the 1960s. And so the 251 established the historical benchmark for mechanized infantry, proving that in modern warfare the speed of the assault is only as fast as the infantry's ability to keep up pace with the tanks. A panzer group may be fearsome, but a panzer group backed by armored infantry may sometimes be unstoppable. And so it contributed to Germany's horrid aggression and the Nazis' genocidal war. Fortunately, the Nazis were not unstoppable because war is not about having good ideas. It's about numbers, morale, and resources. But more than anything, it is about being on the right side, not the aggressor's side. And so, as a weapon of aggression that ultimately could not fulfill its purpose, the 251 is a monument to the morally depraved folly of a nation that came to believe that it had the right and power to impose its murderous will on the world, but paid a heavy price as that illusion of supremacy went up in flames together with its armored vehicles. Never forget. Tanks get the spotlight, but it takes a lot more than tanks alone to negotiate a war. Plenty of other vehicles and pieces of equipment serve the terrible German war machine in equally impressive, but even more overlooked ways. Understanding how they came about helps us build bulwarks against their use as tools for the aggressors of the world. What would you like to see next on our rearmament series? Let us know in the comments below. I also have a special message from Tom Aldis, who pestered me several times to let him write a script on the 251, who says the 251 is one of his favorite vehicles of the war, partly because it's so fascinating, but mostly because Sd.Kfz is so satisfying to say. Help me to keep him quiet and also produce more history content for you guys by joining the Time Ghost Army at patreon.com or at timeghost.tv. It is thanks to our army that our World War II channel is already home to the largest documentary series on the war ever produced, and it is thanks to you that it's still growing even now. Thank you.